Welcome everyone, Adam Lafacci, your moderator, rejoining you, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Recruiting, Selecting, and Placing Volunteers. Once again, I'm Adam Lafacci, and I'll be one of the moderators joining you throughout the day today, and I'll be assisting with any technical issues you have. And I'm joined by Greg Stevens from the American Alliance of Museums, and I'll turn it over to Greg now to say hello.
Thanks very much, Adam. As Adam mentioned, I'm Greg Stevens, Assistant Director for Professional Development here at the American Alliance of Museums, and very happy to be joining you all today for this program on recruiting, selecting, and placing volunteers. Today's program is sponsored by the Getty Foundation, and of course, thank you very much to our fine colleagues at Learning Times for doing an excellent job of producing this program. Today's program is one of a series of webinars on volunteer management that we are producing in collaboration with the American Association for Museum Volunteers. And I'm very happy to have joining us today my colleague Lois Cooter, who is the president of AAMV and also the volunteer coordinator at the Academy of Natural Sciences. Lois, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure, and hello everyone. Yes, I work at the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and am president as a volunteer for AAMV. And on behalf of the American Association for Museum Volunteers, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that we put together with the American Alliance of Museums. Hope you'll find it interesting and helpful, and that you'll consider joining the AAMV network of museum volunteers and program managers. If you don't have a copy of our book, consider this too. This is a handbook that kind of gives you the nuts and bolts of how to put together a volunteer program. And we have been drawing from this for our series of webinars that we've been doing, including this one.
Thanks, Lois. And before I introduce today's presenters, I do want to draw attention to the chat box that is on the left-hand side of the screen. And in these volunteer management webinars, we typically see a lot of activity and a lot of people sharing ideas and information and inspiration about their own volunteer programs. So as much as we have to offer in our prepared content, you all can contribute to the content as well by actively participating as much as you are. So thank you all for doing that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the stage over to our colleagues, Richard Harker and Carly Austin, who are going to talk a little bit more in detail about recruiting, selecting, and placing volunteers. And Richard, I believe you're first on stage.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Greg. And good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're still out on the West. It's really exciting to be with you all today for our program on recruiting, selecting, and placing volunteers. And like Greg said, we really want you to be part of the conversation in the chat box. And so we're going to be trying to keep an eagle eye and spotting some of the comments which maybe inspire some discussion or some questions or some thoughts and pondering today. So that's going to be our goal. But let me sort of outline what our plans are for this program today. We really have kind of four goals this afternoon. We will be examining existing recruiting, selection and placement efforts, and discuss what has worked for us and our different institutions, as well as what we've heard from many of our colleagues in the field through our work with AAMV and our discussions in preparing for today. We will also, I think with your help, begin to develop new and updated volunteer recruitment, selection, and placement strategies. So get ready to share your experiences, and like I said, we're going to be keeping an eagle eye on the comment box. We will look at one of the most important topics in managing a volunteer program, and that is conducting background checks and interviews, and I know a lot of you will probably have questions about that. And we'll talk about the most effective methods for placing volunteers in your institution to ensure that the volunteer program can be as successful as possible. So we're going to be covering a lot today, and we hope that you'll feel encouraged and empowered to work with your volunteers after today's discussion, and also to be able to really successfully recruit. So we're going to try and bring in as many examples of our own as we can, and also just share as many resources. So I know that the PDF handout is available for you guys, and we'd love for you to download it and share also with each other your comments and strategies. So to begin with, we want to find out how you currently recruit for volunteers. And we've been sort of talking about this today, and everybody sort of take part in the poll and tell us Do you recruit or do you not recruit? How do you recruit? Do you use internal methods like flyers, websites, word of mouth, ads, volunteer listings? What are your different strategies and suggestions? And I think this is going to really help us get an understanding of sort of where everybody is at. And it's good to see that only so few of you are not recruiting.
Yeah, this is Carly, and it's so interesting to see the mix that people have. I especially like, word of mouth, because that's we always want volunteers like what we currently have.
Yeah, and this is Craig. I'm looking at the 25% or so who say they need help, and I'm hoping that we're able to do that today.
Absolutely. We're hoping that they've come to the right place. I also think it's so interesting that sort of, when we talk about museums, we have such a range of different institutions and size and scope and mission statement. And so, I imagine, we have over 100 folk in the webinar this afternoon. So I imagine we're just going to have so many people coming from so many different backgrounds. And that's why I love the chat feature, because it just allows everybody to kind of brainstorm as well. But that is so interesting. So everybody's using their websites and flyers, or a lot of people are using their websites and flyers and word of mouth. And then only half of folk, or just over half of folk, are using external methods. And I think that's maybe a cost issue as well, which is really prohibitive for some folk.
Using everything you can possibly find is always a good technique. This is Lois. So I find that my website works really effectively, but I need other methods too to reach other types of people. Well, and also, before we even begin talking about recruiting, selecting, and placing volunteers, let's ask you guys to think again. Do you even have a budget for recruiting? And we'd encourage you again to share sort of in the poll here. Because this is going to sort of help us think about the different ways that we recruit. And I'm not surprised, unfortunately, to see that, almost 3/4 of you right now do not have a budget for recruiting. How about you, Lois and Carly?
We didn't. The Musical Instrument Museums is a relatively new museum. We're only 4 years old, and we didn't for a long time. And then we found that there were some challenges getting them. So the last 2 years we were able to do a budget, and it's about 2% of the total marketing budget to do recruitment, and it's made a huge, huge difference. And we'll kind of talk about some of that later.
Great. Thank you all for sharing. So before we even begin to think about how to recruit, let's sort of remind ourselves why we even use volunteers in the first place. Because like I said, we're all coming from such different places. Museums, historic houses, zoos, cultural centers. And at the Museum of History and Holocaust Education, where I work, we use volunteers in so many different ways, as docents, as greeters, working with our education and outreach programs, conducting oral histories, working on curatorial projects, and even supporting our PR and marketing team as well. And as many of you do, I know we all rely on those 64.5 million people who volunteer once a year. And I think even without these folk, we really often can't do what we're trying to do, whether it's the public programs, whether it's the school tours, whatever it is we're trying to do, we really rely on so many different people. But I know that we at the MHHE struggle to recruit those 35 to 44-year-olds who are most likely to volunteer, because that's just an age group around us that we really have been unable to sort of tap into. So we all face lots of different challenges, but harnessing the energy and passion of volunteers, I think, really doesn't happen overnight. And you need to have a number of building blocks in place before you can even start recruiting to your museum. And I would say that here are 7 building blocks that we've been brainstorming about that we think are really important before you even think about recruiting. And the first is to have a really strong and clear and well thought out mission statement that is going to outline what you hope your volunteers will do and achieve, and why that is really, really important. And thinking through this step and conducting a needs assessment and outlining what your recruiting goals are is also really, really important, because it's going to help you just speak so much more confidently about the type of activities that you're going to have on offer and sort of what you're going to need volunteers for. We also think having really strong position descriptions is important because that's going to help you advertise. It's going to help you be really sort of clear to people when you're talking to them in whatever ways, whether it's through that targeted media or whether it's through your website or flyers or Facebook or whatever it is. But we also think that having sort of outlining your tangible and intangible benefits of volunteering is really also going to help you be able to say to somebody who you meet, hey, this is why you should come and volunteer with us. Like, here are the really cool things, both tangible and intangible. And I saw that somebody already started offering a conversation in the chat box about, do you offer your volunteers membership? And that's a really great question. We at the MHHE don't, because we don't have a membership program. We're a free museum. But we offer our volunteers the kind of benefits that other museums would offer to a membership program. We also think as well, moving on, that you need volunteer policies and procedures in place. And to have these sort of upfront or to establish these later really also helps you learn what the sort of parameters of your volunteer program are. What can your volunteers do and not do? How much time should they take for breaks? Where should they do? What should they wear? What time should they show up? How do they record their hours? All of that kind of thing. And that really helps everybody. It helps you. It helps the volunteers. It helps your colleagues who maybe aren't working with the volunteers so closely, but are able to come in and sort of say, oh yeah, I know what Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so is meant to be doing. And then, of course, before you even start, you also want some great recruitment materials. And we've worked a lot with our PR and marketing team to be able to develop those. And we'll talk about a little later on about some of the different ways that you might change those to appeal to different audiences and diverse groups. But we think that, the recruitment materials can include all of the intangible and tangible benefits that you might have identified already, can include the volunteer descriptions and the position descriptions, and also what the mission statement of your volunteer program is. So these are just the kind of 7 things that we think are absolutely crucial before you even start thinking about how you're going to be recruiting, and even before you get to the point of sort of what to do when you have volunteers in the door. But let's kind of pause there for a second. And is there anything we're missing from that list, or anything that you would add? What recruitment methods or sort of what strategies have we missed at this stage of the game? And Lois and Carly, is there anything that you would chime in and add there?
Well, it's a hard question, but I think knowing why people come to your museum, why they enjoy your museum, I think recruiting for me often is the particular appeal of what you're doing, whether it's history or dinosaurs or animals or whatever. That's where you can target people and find people that are motivated to actually support your museum and be there and want to learn what you have as kind of content core.
Yeah, I think that, really having all that information that you're looking for about why, setting it up before you start is so important.
Well, and I agree, Carly, and I think also the more we know about ourselves as museums in general, the better it helps us with whatever we're doing. So, I also run our education and outreach program, and just knowing sort of the type of people who visit, what people think of us, really just helps me in so many different ways. And I think one of those ways is in how we approach volunteers, how we market ourselves to volunteers, and also how we talk to them. I think these are really important things to think about as we go forward.
Definitely. So, like Richard said, recruitment's all built on that framework. And you really, and it's all about communication. And you really need to create a clear and inviting message. And once you kind of have that language, you can recycle and reuse it in all the ways that you recruit. I saw that some people mentioned, do they use Facebook or online, or what are those different methods? But once you kind of have those, that recruitment message, you can use it in different ways. And a good recruitment message should really address these bullet points that are up here, like how do volunteers contribute to the visitor's experience, and why does the museum value volunteers? And as a part of that, what benefits do volunteers receive? and what type of volunteer opportunities are out there, who can volunteer, and what do volunteers say about their experience. And so once you kind of address that, you can remember that no one-size-fits-all method for framing your recruitment message. You really have to decide what role your volunteers play, and once it's a part of your strategic plan, it really allows you to develop those position descriptions that you're looking for, and it really aligns with your museum message. And that way you can make things that are inviting, they're descriptive of what you're looking for. It's a great way to match the language to the group that you're trying to recruit, like Richard was talking earlier about, trying to, and Lois was too, about, who would be interested, what they are. But it's also a great time to dispel any myths that you might have as well. Are you an art museum and everyone thinks that it's just older women wearing pearls that volunteer there? Are you a science museum and you have to have a science background and, to volunteer? So it's a great time to address those as well. And so we have some great examples that other volunteer organizations have shared with us. And this one's from the Virginia Living Museum. What I love about this recruitment process is that they show different volunteer roles that are there. So I think that's great. You can visualize it. And it also has basic information about how to volunteer and what the process is like. And so it's a great general one. And then here for the Musical Instrument Museum, here's a really targeted volunteer recruitment for the Museum Guide, which is our docent program. And there's one of the things I think you can take from that is there's this sense of immediacy or a call to action where it says apply now. And the language is trying to be inviting while clarifying background needs. It says you don't have to have a musical background. Everything you need to know is covered in training. So, and then here's another great one from the Great Lakes Science Center. And I love how the lend us a hand and join our team are, these great, strong, calls to action. But it also points out the altruistic benefits to being a volunteer there. It says it's rewarding as it is fun. So I think that's really helpful. And it also has language on how volunteers fit into the museum. They talk about how their volunteers are essential to the success of their organization. So those are all different kind of examples on ways that different museums do that.
And Carly, let me interrupt you just very quickly. This is Greg. I just want to let everybody know that some of these examples that Carly's been referencing in the slide deck are also part of your PDF handout that's in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. So you'll find lots of examples at the end of that PDF. Back to you, Carly.
Thanks. And so once you have that message, your recruitment, the message that you want to share, then it's kind of the time to develop your recruitment strategies. And we've kind of, when Richard and Lois and I have been kind of talking with Greg on putting this together, we kind of identified that there's two different types of recruitment. General recruitment strategies that can attract people who can be matched with any number of your volunteer positions and be placed accordingly. And then there's also the targeted strategy. To seek volunteers who can meet needs of a particular position. So maybe you do docent training at a certain time, or maybe you have a special exhibition, or you have a kind of a large-scale festival that comes out. So we kind of have an audience question for you. As like Richard said, we have a lot of different people coming from different museums. So do you have a volunteer recruitment strategy? Is it yes? Do you wing it? Are you not sure?
And this is so interesting to me to see what everyone's responses are, Carly. And I'm fascinated. And I think one thing that maybe we're really encouraging people is to think about having a strategy. Because as we talk about all these different methods today, really being methodical and thoughtful about the different steps you take actually can be really, really helpful. And there we go, 65% of folks saying, no, we wing it.
Yeah. I might say, too, having some kind of a strategy means that you can plead for a budget to implement it. So it does sometimes help to have a plan. even if it's pretty general.
Yeah.
And this is Greg. I think one of my questions might be for the majority of people who are responding who just wing it. What is the barrier to putting a strategy in place? Is it what we already know, that we're all overworked? We don't have enough staff. We don't have enough resources. What are some of those barriers that Lois, Carly, Richard, that you might see that keep the folks from putting a strategy in place?
I think for this is Carly, I think for a lot of places that are small, especially if you're a small museum and you don't have a volunteer manager or a volunteer coordinator, there's a lot of different people that might need volunteers but don't always have the time nor the resources on how to get volunteers and to keep them. So I think that can be a huge barrier wrapped into a larger planning.
And I see that one of our colleagues in the audience, Jason, says we have plenty of volunteers, so we don't organize a strategy because we'll end up with people without things to do.
That's, I think that's a good thing to talk about, and that's a good segue to kind of our next question. If you do have a strategy for the, was it 30% that said that they had one, with whom do you work with? Is it within your own department? Do you partner with your PR, your marketing department? Are there other departments you work with? Are you solely responsible for the recruitment?
This is so interesting, and I saw Jason's response as well, Greg, and I was envious of him with his too many volunteers. But
a good thing to have, right?
I know, and I think we would all like to think that we work so collaboratively with other departments, but it is so challenging when everybody has so many things, and your PR and marketing team are doing public programs and school tours and everything else, and so. These are really challenges, but that's such an interesting split. Look at that. Almost a third of our audience in all of those different categories there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. So, and I agree with you. It's, all museums are different, and we're always kind of looking at what they are. And so, there's a nice, talking about the general recruitment strategy and targeted, that really kind of looking what Jason is doing to see, if he has a lot of volunteers, maybe he only needs a targeted strategy at certain times, or not. But we always want something for volunteers to do, because there's nothing worse than volunteering and not having something to do.
And I might point out too, if you throw out a huge wide net, pleading with people to come and volunteer, and you do fill up, then it can be embarrassing when you have to say, well, we don't need you after all. So you have to be realistic about it, and that's where kind of setting targets is good. And telling people if openings are limited, warning them this is a very popular area, we don't take everybody. So you're not making promises in advance, and people are delusional about what the possibilities are.
Yeah, I completely agree. So we have some of different volunteer recruitment strategies that other museums have shared with us. And like Greg said, you can pull this all from the PDF. And this is from the Virginia Living Museum. And this is really for their general recruitment for that year. And it shows the different techniques for recruiting. So, what materials they're going to use, print, electronic, where they're going to go, and are they going to be at presentations? Are they things that they're going to be doing at websites? And so I think this is really helpful to plan for your museum's general needs, so you're not overwhelmed if you have larger programs, or like Jason and we were all talking about before, if you are in that great position where you have so many volunteers, you don't need more, you kind of know what your plan is like. And then here is a sample from a targeted. It's for the museum guide training from the Musical Instrument Museum. And, this really came about because we didn't have a plan. We didn't have a plan in place for recruitment for the museum guides. We winged it, and it didn't go well, and we didn't have enough to do our program. And so afterwards, we said, oh no, we need to sit down, and we are. I oversee the education team, and so we work with the volunteer services department and the marketing team collaboratively, had a meeting, created an agenda for, for it, how we're going to recruit, what we're going to do, what's the marketing strategy, how we're going to get them in the door, all those things. And it made a huge difference. We had, in January, we had 49 museum guides sign up, the largest class ever. So I can tell you, if you can spend a bit of time and do recruitment, it will be very, very helpful.
I love that, Carly, and I would also agree with Lois as well that the more strategy and sort of planning you can use, the more it can help you leverage that with your sort of higher ups and your directors and your other staff members. But what we want to think about is, so once you have a strategy in place, and of course I think we would encourage you to develop one, it's actually time to go out there and recruit. And we've been thinking about the act of recruiting, and we want to think about it in sort of two different ways. The first is through targeted strategies. This includes, posting advertisements and information on your website to target your sort of regular visitors to the website. We also think about referrals from current volunteers as being a really good targeted strategy. And then, as we sort of started talking about earlier, there's a way to connect to your museum members and maybe sort of asking them to volunteer, or maybe also to use those members as a sort of word of mouth vehicle, who might go and find their friends who are interested in volunteering. And then we also think about staff outreach as a way of sort of targeted outreach. And so what we do here at the Museum of History and Holocaust Education is all of our staff that work with the public, when they're going out to schools, when they're going out to community centers, when they're speaking at the Kiwanis Club, whatever it is they're doing, they know that we are looking for volunteers, and they know sort of the various roles that we have open. And so all of our staff who are interacting with the public are sort of actively scouring the room and thinking and sort of looking for moments and people who they might think might sort of assist our volunteer program. And that's been a really great way of, our director gives a public lecture and people come up to her afterwards and say, hey, what a wonderful job. That was so great. Thank you so much. And she says, oh, well, if you're really, really interested, we'd love for you to come and maybe volunteer with us. So that can be a really effective method of doing that. But we also have thought about visitors and educators as sort of a really targeted strategy. And so people who come to our museum, we know they're interested because they've made the effort to come in the first place. So how can we reach out to them? How can we encourage them? And how can we let them know that we have volunteer opportunities? And so that's something we're working on right now, is to think about ways that we can really advertise that. And we're actually doing that through our website, our new website, which hopefully is going to launch in the next few weeks. And we're really sort of targeting people who know us or know about us and want to sort of think about ways that they can come and volunteer with us. And that's the same way with educators as well. And that's whenever we have school groups or homeschool parents or any college professors who come with groups to the museum, we're really reaching out to them and saying, who might you know that would want to volunteer with us, or might you want to volunteer with us in your free hours? So these are our different targeted strategies that we might use. And then, you have these generalized strategies, and these are sort of broader strategies that might just be kind of blanket marketing, whether that's advertising in the media, or, a section of the newspaper, the local newspaper, recruitment events, posting at the volunteer center and job banks, community organizations and local businesses. These are all different ways that we think that, different places and venues that you might target your sort of generalized approaches and some of those pieces that Carly showed us earlier. And I know, Carly, you recently did some media coverage, right?
Yes, we did. We were able to do a press release for our museum guide training. So that was helpful. And as a part of that strategy, we did do advertising. And I saw that Alexandria mentioned something about having an open house for people interested in volunteering. And that's actually what we advertised, is to come to an open house for museum guide training. And we got great responses from that. Literally, more than triple attendance from that. So because we were able to plan and ask for a budget, we were able to place an advertisement, and then that's been a huge success for us. So I find that the advertising has been great. And then I think another thing too is working with local businesses. Since corporate volunteering is big right now, that's been really great for festivals that we've had, like large one-day programs or festivals that we're planning. So those are really great opportunities as well.
Those are both really great, Carly. Thank you so much for sharing those.
I've also found that specific groups, again, going back to the idea of what you really do, if you are an art museum, you might want to go to a local gallery and put some information there, or contact an art club or classes. You kind of have to find your niche there. We've contacted like entomology groups for people to come and help with curatorial work. So they're really nice things that you can do where you're going to get a good match, and that's kind of important too. Throwing out a wide net is great if you just need numbers and really want to get a quantity. But if you have targeted needs, then you need to find the people that are really the good match for that.
Yeah, and I would add on to that as well, Lois, that we are a university museum, and a lot of universities have volunteer fairs and volunteer organizations. And so every fall we go to the big volunteer fair, which is right at the start of the fall semester, when people are signing up and new to college and looking for things to do. And we hand out a lot of information and get a lot of email addresses so that when we do need those numbers, whether it's, to help with whatever various activities we have at the public program, we have sort of that ready-made audience right there to sort of tap into. And that also works in two ways, because it helps us get lots of volunteers, but it also just helps us raise our awareness. So I think you can also sell this to your sort of outreach and your PR and marketing teams and say, look, this is a great way to get volunteers. But also, if you went to a college campus or another kind of big community festival, that can be really a great way of just raising the profile of your institution more broadly, as well as the volunteer program.
I totally agree with you, Richard.
Well, thank you, Carly. So one of the questions we've been really wrestling with as we prepared for this webinar is the idea of how do you recruit for diversity? And we don't just mean ethnic or racial diversity, but also gender, age, education, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, and physical ability. And this is a survey that Carly did just at the end of last year, asking museum volunteer managers and sort of program managers how diverse they think their volunteer corps is and in what ways. And we've really sort of been struggling and wrestling with this, but interestingly, physical ability and sexual orientation are sort of the ways that volunteer managers feel their volunteer corps is the least diverse, and that ethnicity and age are sort of, relatively speaking, the most diverse parts of their volunteer corps. But we wanted to sort of throw this out to you and ask you to sort of chime in here, because we've really been talking a lot about this in our preparation and haven't found that we've got the sort of the golden bullet or the right answer. But as we've been talking, we've really figured out that you need to decide what is right and who is right for your institution. And I often think about ways to make our volunteer corps more diverse and reflect a much broader range of experiences, which I think will help deepen and enrich maybe not only our volunteer program, but also the institution more widely. And I know a lot of museums are concerned about reaching new and diverse groups and audiences. And I think beginning with your volunteer program can actually be a really effective way of achieving that goal. And it shows different communities that you are committed to working with them. But I would really love to hear your thoughts on this. So in what ways does your volunteer program represent diversity? What different things do you do? So Isabel says it really, really doesn't. I know, yeah. And I hear you, Isabel, because I feel like sometimes we don't either. And that's something I think we are struggling with. And Sadie's with us.
Yeah, I see that. It's a challenge based on where I think location is a big thing of where you are. You know, some locations of different museums, the population might not be as diverse too, so that can be a challenge.
Mm-hmm. And I just saw someone mention teen volunteers as the chat bar flew by, and that's really that was Phyllis, and that's really exciting to think about teen volunteers. We've started.
Go ahead.
We've started a teen internship program for high school students, and we've sort of just had one student this semester. But we're starting to think about new ways that we might engage some younger audiences and do some volunteering programs.
Yeah, I was
Well,
this
is good. Go ahead, Les.
We're speaking over each other. Too much to say here. I was going to say our teen, we use a lot of teens. A third of our volunteers are teens, and we're in a big city, so it's easy to recruit them. But that is by far the most diverse age population we have among our volunteers. Partly because teens are more diverse these days in terms of their orientation, whereas older people are a little integrated maybe. And maybe a little more stereotypically thinking about museums and who they belong to and who should be there. So
well, Lois, what are your, speaking of your teen volunteers, what are some of the challenges and successes you've had with that demographic?
Well, teens are teens, and they're not adults. So they do require training, and they require a lot of supervision, so you need to be ready for that. If you're going to have a teen program, you need to dedicate staff to it that enjoy working with them, because they're goofy, they're young.
Yeah, I agree, Lois, as well, and we've been really lucky that the team who's been volunteering with us this semester has just been so tremendous and so sort of responsible. But I could definitely foresee a situation in which, you know, somebody wakes up and really doesn't want to come and volunteer at the museum, and so sort of just doesn't come and doesn't call. And you know, we would find, and I think we found that we need to prepare even college students who come and volunteer with us to dress professionally and to understand, you know, that the museum is also a professional place. So we've had to, you know, train them about dress standards and also about punctuality. And if you're running late, to give someone a call and let them know that you're running late, because otherwise we worry that you know, had some accident on the way in or something.
That's so funny, because for us at the Musical Instrument Museum, partially, I'm sure, because of the population that is here in Phoenix, you know, we have less diversity with age, and a part of that has to do with some of the volunteer needs. Right now, we need more volunteers to assist us for school tours, which of course makes it hard for someone who's working or is in school to be there. But we do have, you know, weekend opportunities too, but it does limit that a bit. But we do have a much better mix of gender and race. So it's interesting how it works for everybody.
Well, this is Greg. I would also say that a lot of this conversation about recruiting for volunteer diversity is reflective of the overall issues that sometimes plague museums, where we know that most people who work in museums, 80%, are Caucasian women. Are our museums places that foster diversity? Do diverse people see themselves in our museums? So
that's where you're
that's part of it.
Yeah,
right. Mm-hmm.
Sorry. I was going to say that's part of the recruiting tactics, too. If you have visuals that show somebody that looks like you, you're more likely to come. So it can be a strategy that you use to show that you are diverse already, and that's much more welcoming for somebody who might have a thought that it's only white women that go to volunteer in museums.
Well, and I'm so glad that you brought up strategies there, Lois, because we did brainstorm about some sort of broad ideas about how we might think about recruiting for diversity. And, you know, the top one, emphasizing the altruistic benefits of volunteering, is really the sort of, you know, this is something you should be doing with all your volunteers, not just, you know, different communities in whatever ways that you want to work with. But we've also thought about making personal one-on-one appeals to members of different communities or different groups or different parts of the population that maybe we haven't reached. And that might be talking to a school teacher about teen volunteers, or it might be talking to a community leader in a ethnic community. So that's one way. And then also attending and participating in cultural, religious, or fraternal events, I think is actually a really kind of exciting possibility. And this might force a museum to kind of step out of its usual sort of, here are the places we go and are represented, and maybe, try something new and visit somewhere different. And whatever the group it is that you're trying to reach, I think, showing that you're in the community and you're not scared of being out in the community, and you're open to having an honest and open dialogue with a different community, whoever it may be, can actually go a long way to building trust. And I think that sort of helps to connect with community organizations, our next point. And of course allows you to distribute material at these community events. So I think that could actually be a really exciting strategy, is just to say, hey, where do we not go? Who do we not talk to? And how can we maybe try and talk to those people, whoever they are, and just listen to them as well. And then but we also have on there at the bottom, target media to market, and that can be anything from, changing the language of your media if you have a bilingual community that you're trying to reach out to, or even, if you're reaching out to teens, that you think about the language that teens are using versus the language that, middle-aged, sort of middle-class professional is using. I think those two things are really very different. And I know some of you out there and have formed advisory groups where you bring volunteers in and you say to them, really, how can we do things differently? How can we do things better? And that can be a really powerful way of hearing what people want and what people need from your institution. So those are just 7 different ways that we thought about recruiting for diversity. But I'm sort of looking at the chat box and I'm just seeing some of the conversation. And Cindy says she really recently went to Lego Fest in Raleigh to promote the museum as a whole and as a volunteering place. And yes, you go to Lego Fest and you just meet these families and kids, and presumably that's a place, Cindy, that you've not been to before, but really maybe makes new connections and just gets the sort of word out there about what your museum is all about, and that you really welcome volunteers from all different kinds of communities. So those are just some of our thoughts on this. But what else? What other questions and comments do you have here as we sort of pause for a second and think about the challenges facing us and in the ways that we recruit for diversity?
I love the Museum Ambassador Program at from Kara in San Francisco. Those are really great. Having teens volunteer and teach other teens is, I think, such a great way to keep the program going and to reach that audience.
Absolutely, and I've seen that as well done at the Zoo Atlanta, and they have a volunteering program where in the summer students from 3 local high schools are trained about some of the animals at the zoo. And so as you go around the zoo, you see the teens in their t-shirts, and you can ask them questions about the pandas or the baboons or whatever the animals are. And they've just really sort of learned a lot. It's really a kind of, it's a professional development opportunities for these high school kids. And it's super cool.
Yeah, and I have, I see a lot of people talking about teens, and do they get credit for it? Does it school credit for it, or is it after hours? We are going to be, this fall, we're launching with actually the Girl Scouts as a community partner. We're launching a Girl Scout museum guide program where Girl Scout teens, so I think are they the ambassadors, juniors, that level, will be, they'll learn how to be museum guides, and then they will lead tours on Girl Scout days here at the museum. So, that's also a good way to create a kind of a teen program, is to partner with a community organization.
I think it's also important for teens to have tasks that are good for teens. Yeah, sending them off in a corner to do some really mundane office task might not work very well. They might fall asleep. You really have to have positions that are going to be appealing, where they're going to have a chance to learn, develop skills, and again, have good interaction with staff who can help them develop skills. A lot of our teens come in and they're afraid to talk to adults, or they're just not very good at communication skills because they haven't had much practice. So you need to kind of look at it as an experiment. They're part of your audience too. You're teaching them. They're not so much as being contributors as they are someone you're contributing to, informing and kind of helping to move up in life and perhaps develop a lifelong love for museums.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just saw Jillian chimed in that for some teens who are introverted, those mundane office tasks are great. And I agree. And we've actually, had one of our, we've had our teen volunteer this semester doing some research and some sort of helping the curatorial department because, she isn't the most outgoing student and sort of really enjoys doing research and writing. And so that's something that she's really sort of thrived on. But I think whoever you reach out to, knowing what they are interested in and learning as much about them as you can when you interview them can really help, and also in the sort of application phase, can really help you make sure that you're giving the right jobs and the right sort of tasks to the right people.
True for any age and background and
Absolutely.
diverse person.
So once you're kind of looking at all of that, really the contact and the application are kind of the nuts and bolts of getting a volunteer in your door. And this is often, really the first contact that you have with a potential volunteer. And so what I found with recruiting volunteers is you want to get basic information and then also be able to answer some basic questions. And then you'll probably want to have some highlights about the program that you can use both in written to share that with potential volunteers and, to communicate it verbally as well. So some of the basic information that you're going to make sure that you want to capture is all the things that you're kind of looking for from them. So, right, you're going to have to get their contact information, know some of their background, what are their skills, interests, and hobbies, and this, I do really think it's important to have in your application because you might be able to pull from it later. And also knowing when they're available, why they're interested, what type of experience might be good. All of that's really, really important to have. And so we have, again, some samples that you can download from the PDF, and here's from your museum, Richard. That's like the basic application. I think it helps it. Some of the things it talks about is what you'd be interested in and when you're available, which really helps with scheduling.
Well, and it just helps, it helps down the line to have that application form and to have those details, and you just get that up front, and then you file it away, and you just know, you have it there. And so it's just so helpful for me and my colleague, Patricia, who also works with our volunteer program, to have that information up front.
Yeah, I think it's one of those essential things that all volunteer programs can look at. So Richard's one is a great application, and also the book that we referenced earlier, Transforming Museum Volunteering, also has some samples as well, and I'd be happy to share what we have at MIM too, if you're ever looking for other ones or trying to create them. And then background checks. I think background checks, the three of us when we were putting this together definitely talked about background checks a lot. And it's really an essential management tools. Museums really have to be concerned about the safety and security of, the guests, the staff, and the volunteers, but of course of the building and the collection. So, there's a lot of different types of background checks that you can do. It can be personal or employment reference. It can be a criminal background check. It could be fingerprinting. It could be a driving record check, a substance abuse check, or a child abuse clearance. And really, each museum is different. And what I really encourage you to do is, if you don't have a policy, is really to work with your HR department to determine what your needs are to have. And you'll want to take into consideration what the volunteers are doing as well. Are they working very intensely with children? Then you might need something like a criminal or fingerprint clearance card. Are they going to be driving as a part of the volunteering? So maybe then you need the driving record check. So it kind of depends on what your organization is like, and then what the roles of the volunteers are going to do. And so we did do a survey, like Richard was mentioning, and 64% of the people that took it said that they did do a background check. And so what I think is really interesting is that by far the majority of people said that they did a criminal background check. And I don't know, so we kind of wanted to ask you guys, what type of background checks do you do? Do you do personal and employment references? Are they criminal? Do you do fingerprint, driving records, substance abuse, child abuse? Maybe you do something else? Or do you do none?
And Carly, this is Greg. I was noticing in the chat box that we've got folks responding in a variety of ways. Some institutions don't do any background checks at all and rely on trust building with the volunteer. And other folks are very particular about doing background checks because of past thefts at the museum.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's so diverse, and it's interesting to see what people are saying that they do.
Well, and also so much just depends on state law and local law, and if you have an HR department, what their rules are. And we are a university museum, and so our university HR department has all kinds of rules and restrictions. And so I think we all just have to be mindful of kind of what are those external factors which determine these things for us, as well as what are the sort of the internal things as well.
Yes, and there are budgets that are involved as well. And here at the Musical Instrument Museum, all of our volunteers go through the same process that any of our paid members would go through. So that means that we do a background check, which includes, it looks at things like driving records, all of the, child abuse, all of that. But they also do a drug screen as well. And so that's, some of the things that we do. I don't know. What about you, Lois?
Well, we're just starting this, and we are doing the FBI fingerprinting, criminal background checks, and child abuse clearance. And the caveat here is that if you've had a volunteer program going for a long time and then suddenly this appears, you're going to have to be very careful in terms of how you introduce it to volunteers, because it can appear to be a lack of trust. It can be a highly negative experience for them, depending upon how it's introduced to them and what their experience has been otherwise. A lot of my volunteers say, oh yeah, we do this for everything else we do too as volunteers. Others saying, who have been here for 25 years and are working more behind the scenes and have very limited access with kids, are upset about it because suddenly they're being asked to do something that seems invasive of their privacy. So it takes a lot of care. It can be very sensitive, and you can drive away people if you don't do it carefully.
That's a really good point.
And I like Lauren's comment in the chat box that, in essence, really all you need is one bad situation, one unfortunate incident to bring everybody's attention to the importance of background checks.
Yeah, it's, it's really helpful. It's really helpful to have them in some way.
Absolutely. So as we sort of reflect on some of the comments and thoughts in the chat box, Lauren also said our court-ordered volunteers do work on the grounds and landscaping, while somebody else said that they don't use court-ordered volunteers. At the Museum of History and Holocaust Education, we found that just from a reliability point of view, when someone calls us with court-ordered volunteer opportunity or for a court-ordered opportunity, they've just been super unreliable. So when we receive those calls, our policy has been to sort of say, thanks, but no thanks, we're busy or we're full right now, because we've just found that in our past experience that, people who are coming from that point of view have been really, really unreliable. But that again is something that I think each individual institution needs to sort of decide on their own way. But I see that Karine says that they have a specific orientation for them first, and only use them in specific situations, which I really like. And I really like the idea that you would have a specific orientation where you sort of lay out your goals and your strategies for working with folk come in who have a cause.
Yeah, I think that's so important because it's all about the fit. It's all about what is the right, what your needs are and what the volunteers' interests are and how you can really fit them together.
Absolutely, and that's such a great segue into our interviewing section because ultimately bringing volunteers in for face-to-face interviews is so important. And what do you do? But what do you do when you have them through the door and are ready to be interviewed? And we've actually had some really fun conversations because we all have 3 really different styles to interview in. And at the Museum of History and Holocaust Education, after we've had the informal introduction and meeting with a volunteer, we like to invite them for a formal interview to emphasize the level of responsibility that comes to volunteering at the Holocaust Museum, because that kind of carries some responsibility. And I think this helps us get off on the right foot in demonstrating the level of commitment and seriousness that is involved at the museum. And I'll conduct this with Patricia, my colleague, our museum manager, who also has responsibilities with our volunteers. But I know that Carly and Lois have sort of different styles of interviewing.
Yes, we do. At MIM, we do volunteer. All volunteers go through an interview process, and when they're coming to the education department specifically for the museum guide program, so they will interview with the general volunteer office, and if they think that they would be a good fit to be in the education department, then we actually sit down and talk to them specifically for the museum guide program, which is our docent program, because it's the most intensive program, and we want to make sure it's very it's very clear and dispelled any myths about what it is. Our focus mostly is on school tours, although we certainly do adult tours, but the biggest need is for that. So we want to make sure that that's clear. And our questions that we have, are always, we try and make it a meet and greet type of program, but ask the same types of questions. So we try and make it informal. We sit in a cafe, but, we are looking for specific things.
Yeah, I'd say ours can be more formal or informal, and I like staff who are going to be working with the volunteers to actually do the interviews and not me. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. But it's as much so that that person can see what they're getting into firsthand so that they see the fit and what they're going to be doing and even the physical environment they're going to be working in. So it's kind of a two-way thing, and I think that's really an important function of an interview.
Absolutely, Lois, and I agree. And I think whatever style of interview you have, it's important to ask some questions, some profound questions that really kind of get to the heart of why is this person coming to volunteer with you, and what do they expect. But it's also a great chance for you to lay out, here's what we expect. So I agree. I think it's such a great conversation to have in whatever style. And, to sort of follow on from what Carly said, when we have people come in who want to volunteer as docents in our education program, we will often ask them to speak for 60 seconds about the topic that they know nothing about or haven't prepared about, such as, a cow or farmyard animals or whatever it is, just to kind of see how they think on their feet. And we've used that as a way of just kind of getting an idea of, does the person sat in front of us really, have what it takes to stand out there when there are hundreds of school kids running around and project their voice and think on their feet and sort of all the skills that we know our museum educators need when they're out on the floor of the museum. So here are a few sample questions from the Museum of History and Holocaust Education of things that we would typically ask. And again, these are all in the handout that you can download from the top left of the screen. But whatever your style is, we think that you sort of need to cover the following basic areas. And we've already sort of touched on these already. But what is the volunteers' motivation for volunteering? Why are they here? What do they hope to achieve? Are they here because they love the subject? Are they here because they just need to fulfill some volunteer hours? Like, what is their reason? We also love to ask, what is the relevant knowledge, skills, and experience? And this can really help you place your volunteers so that you really make sure that they end up working with the right people in the right department. And I think that's super, super important as well. We, of course, ask people what their preferred positions and responsibilities are. And I think that's just really good to kind of get a sense of where someone's coming from. If they see themselves as a docent, or if they see themselves in the back doing some office work, or in the curatorial department, or working with the collection, it's just good to know sort of why people are with you. And of course, as Carly already said, we love to ask people what their schedule and availability is. And unfortunately, I've had to turn people away who have said, I'm only available on Monday and Friday afternoons for school groups, when most of our school groups come in the morning on all days of the week. And really, afternoons isn't a time that we sort of have school groups here at the museum. And so we've sort of had to say, we really appreciate your interest. Thank you so much, but unfortunately, that's not going to work. And we're actually going to have some examples later on in the webinar of ways to sort of say no in a friendly and sort of polite way. But we also ask people to say, how much time are you willing to commit? And that sort of goes along with that schedule and availability. And sometimes if someone's just, able to commit a couple of hours a week, that's great for a certain task, a certain department, or a certain supervisor. And for other supervisors or other jobs, that just really isn't enough. So, covering all of these early on, I think really helps you plan and prepare so that you can place the volunteer in the right place, and that you can give them sort of the right supervisor, and that just the whole experience works so well for everybody. Because we know that if you have an unhappy volunteer working in a department that they don't want to work in, it can just be a really big pain and can sort of cause a lot of hassle.
Yeah. So, once you've interviewed them and you've selected them, it's really, placing them. And placement is really important, because if it's not done right, I really think that's a time when you can lose volunteers. So you really need to work with your colleagues to ensure that everyone is buying to the importance of your volunteer program. And I think there are a couple of people in here earlier that have said, how do you get team members to buy, your colleagues to buy into working with volunteers? And, if they're going to work with volunteers, giving them responsibility and training is really, really important to do that. And here at the Musical Instrument Museum, we actually have site supervisors, and they're responsible for the volunteers that come in under them. And they've been given a handbook and training on how to work with volunteers. So I think that's really, really important. Also, for the volunteers, have a service agreement that states their expectations and requirements. And then you want to create a system of evaluating the performance and, kind of checking in on how things work. And here at the Musical Instrument Museum, we just started our first self-reflection. Again, we're 4 years old, so we had museum guides do a self-reflection, which is basically a mirror of what their qualifying tour is. And they had, I think, 5 months to complete the reflection and, turn it in. And it was, one of the motivations was if they wanted to continue and be active, that this was, that they had to do it. So it was, like Lois said, we had to present it. We have to think very carefully about how we presented it to them. But what I found is that it did really allow us to know what's going on, because we have over 100 museum guides and we can't follow all of them all the time. So it really helped us know of what's going on. And it really was good for them to reflect on what they're doing and see how they are. And it also gave them a voice to kind of express their concerns, like, oh, this is something I could work on or not. But always having that place for them to be able to share, kind of what they're thinking about.
That's absolutely right on, Carly. And I just love Barry's comment in the comment chat box there. Our mantra mission is building our crew, whether paid or volunteer. And it is one ship, one mission, one crew. And I just love that. And I think, one way that we might get all of our staff on board with supporting a volunteer program is having the staff themselves interview the volunteers, talking about it in weekly staff meetings or monthly staff meetings. talking about what is so great about the volunteer program, what the volunteers have been up to, who has been coming in for an interview, sort of what your vacancies are, and really making it a sort of central, important piece of the museum's sort of day-to-day business, and making sure that it isn't, sort of nudged to the side as it sometimes often can be.
Richard and Carly, this is Greg. There was a little bit of conversation in the chat box about terms of commitment. You talk about placement and having that service agreement. Do you find any challenges with long periods of commitment, whether it's 6 months or a year or something like that?
It depends on, it can depend on who. It goes back to the audience. So for teens, I think that is a lot harder to do for versus maybe retired adults. And so here at MIM, the requirements are different for the different roles. And so I think that really also helps that really helps with placement. So for the Museum Guide program, it is, the commitment is a 1-year commitment with 2 shifts a month or 24 shifts in a year. Because within that program, we do have a lot of winter residents. So that way they're able to fulfill that commitment there. And now there are other things besides time. They have to do the self-reflection and other things too, but that's kind of that time for that one. I don't know. What about you, Richard?
Well, and I was sort of just looking at the chat box as you were talking there, Carly, and I see Beth says, 1 year minimum, 100 hours. I've also got colleagues who actually, rather than, they'll say, it's a 1-year program, but you also need to leave a deposit with us, which you get back at the end, and that's sort of, to sort of make sure that the time and commitment that we are putting in is sort of worthwhile, and that you don't just kind of drop out, and it gives people some sort of investment. Our greatest challenge at the MHHE is the fact that our volunteering is really seasonal. We have a lot of visitors during the summer, but we don't have a lot of programs. We don't have any school groups. And so, a lot of our visitors come in October and November and January, February, March. And then the rest of the year, when we're trying to recruit docents and educators, it can be really, really challenging. And, I'm sort of reading, I'm learning here, and I'm just trying to figure out which is the best way to go. And I think, like you said, retired adults aren't intimidated by a 1-year commitment, whereas, younger people who are looking maybe to do, a semester or a few weeks or an event are maybe really intimidated by that. So I think being flexible can be helpful, and knowing the types of people that you want to recruit for the type of program could also really, really help you there as well. But, this is something I've really, really struggled with, and I'm not sure we really have a great answer. But, I see Sadie there, who's a great inspiration. She said she's managed to grow the volunteer program to now have over 25 volunteers given over 2,100 hours, and all are committed to 2 hours a week. And that's just since 2010 when she started with 3 volunteers. And that's amazing. And I really love that kind of 2-hour-a-week commitment. But again, it's sort of, if you don't have the work for people for 2 hours a week, then that becomes a problem as well. So you really, need to balance those two things next to each other, I think.
Yeah, and I see Jane's comment, who in Indianapolis, who is talking about, wanting to implement, minimum, but wondering about how they might track it. And, here at MIM and at other museums I've been at, we've used logistics, and that's a really great way to track, who's here when and how many hours that they're giving. So that's one way that we're able to do that.
I think you need to be prepared for a mix of commitments. You're going to get some people that are lifers, others that, 3 months they're gone because their job changes, they are doing elder care or whatever. You have to be realistic about what you're going to get. And there are going to be people that are only available for a certain time frame. And sometimes you have to tailor the position and the work they're doing to the commitment they're able to give. And I think this is changing, too. I think the boomers presumably are not going to be people that want to stay for years and years and years in the same task. They want to move around and do something that has a fixed goal, and then they're gone and doing something else. So I think there's always a lot of turnover, and I don't think people should beat themselves over the head because they find that there are a lot of people that don't make a strong commitment. I think that's probably normal in museums.
Yeah, and I think, like, I noticed Shannon had mentioned, like, she'd asked the question, do you have a program for volunteers that come in, basically for that one event and then leave? And at MIM, we have done that, and it's been through corporate volunteers. So for those, we have these cultural event days that, can get a couple thousand people. And corporate sponsors can have corporate volunteers that come in those days and then help, because we do need help with things like handing out brochures, wayfinding. Maybe they're helping with a basic craft, like those types of things. So that's been really good for those kind of large-scale programs, and we're doing a lot of work with that for, we're going to do our first, we're doing MIM Fest, the music festival, and it's going to be really large, like in our parking lot and museum large. And so we are actually working with a volunteer coordinator who will be scheduling all the volunteers through all the different corporations. So that's, it's a great way for people to come in and commit one time, to the museum for a day that we really need it, because it's a need that we have, but it also fulfills their need for coming in once too.
Yeah, and I would add as well, Carly, that the one-time sort of volunteer is a great way to sort of engage students, college students. And we found that college students really, a day-long program, 10 hours or 8 hours of commitment, whatever it is really something that they can commit to. But maybe, that's all they want to commit to. They don't want to come back every weekend or every week. So we've really found that that's been a great way to kind of engage different student audiences as well. And then I see Janai raises a question in the chat box. Does anyone have issues with tensions between volunteers and different volunteer roles? And I can just sort of reflect on some of my own experiences where, we've had volunteers here who haven't necessarily sort of jived with the roles that they were given, and they've become disgruntled and their work wasn't particularly good and useful, and they've sort of started to complain to other people, and it's really just kind of become this kind of toxic atmosphere. And in that situation, we really had to kind of address the volunteer head on and say, hey, like, what's going on? How can we kind of remedy the situation? Because you're unhappy, it's making our jobs harder, it's making us, sort of less functional as a museum. What can we do to really address sort of your frustration? So that's been my experience of that, Janai.
Yeah, so like, having that voice to, express concerns. There are, and I know that, like, the different roles, what works well as MIM is that we do have a lot of different roles, and volunteers can do multiple roles if they choose to. So that has kind of leveled the playing field. But I was at a very small institution in DC, and there was, a volunteer program that was really, in the volunteer program, there was one that was like really time intensive and one that wasn't, and there could be some type of elitism that would go on sometimes with that. So that can always be a challenge.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the problem of tensions between volunteers who sort of have, I'm the best, or I'm doing the most important thing, or whatever. Again, the idea of team, you're all in it together, that's just something you have to have in your orientation. People will be doing kind of mundane tasks, but everybody needs to know that, and I'm hoping that nobody out there is asking volunteers to do something that's not important, even if it's not very interesting or really requires a huge amount of skills. Everything you should have volunteers doing is something that needs to get done, and that's kind of an motivation and a way to approach it in terms of a team. Everybody's doing something important.
Absolutely. And so we wanted to sort of move on and talk about different ways that you might say yes, no, or even just a maybe to volunteers when they've come and they've interviewed and they've expressed their interest. And, it is okay to say no. Remember that. And I think so many of us get so sort of like, ooh, excited when a volunteer comes through, and we just get really, really excited and we want to say yes, yes, yes. And sometimes recognizing that it's not a good fit is actually, fine to do. It's okay. And, realizing that sometimes having a volunteer like we've been talking about who isn't satisfied can actually cause more work than it sort of is worth. So that's, it's okay to say no, but also developing an institutional policy. And this is maybe something where you get together with your HR department, your director, your higher ups, and you just develop a policy. And that can make it really, it can make it easier to say no to somebody. But I also think if you have your job descriptions laid out and you have everything sort of your ducks in a row with the plan that we talked about much earlier, then that can also really help you say, sorry, but this just isn't quite right for you. But, obviously also taking the emotion out of the decision-making process is obviously really, really important. And that can be challenging sometimes if you're working at a small museum and there's just you or a couple of other people and you know these volunteers and it's a small community. That can be really, really challenging. And so those are super delicate situations which you need to navigate. And I think sometimes if you engage your board of directors and the chair of your board or your director of the museum or your director of HR, somebody who can help sort of pave the way a little bit. And then also, at the end there, to hire volunteers that not only match the position, but also match the museum is really, really important. And just remember that they're not only going to be working in your education department or your collections department or your PR department, but they're representing the museum. And so do these people who, you're hiring or sort of hiring as volunteers, do they fit with the museum and its mission and the type of people that you want representing you to the public?
And so we wanted to give you kind of some samples of what that might look like. And again, you can download these PDFs. But I really encourage you, this is something I put together with our HR department. And I really encourage you, when writing it, to work with your HR department on what it could look like. So this is a straightforward one. We try to take the emotion out of it. And just told them that they're not right for the museum. And then this is what we call kind of the maybe one. And Lois, this is from your organization, right?
Yes.
Do you want to maybe touch some points on it?
Well, instead of just flatly turning somebody away, it's a kinder way to do it, to say that we can't pick you on right now, but reapply. It's a little dangerous to do that because people can reapply a gazillion times and they're never going to be right. So if they are definitely not a match, you want to say no flat out and say, goodbye, we can't use you, you're not a match. But if it is somebody that you could take but you just don't have space, then, keeping them on the line is a good thing to do rather than just saying no, sorry, goodbye.
Yeah, well, and I think that goes back earlier to, I think someone was commenting that they, didn't always have enough jobs for all their volunteers to do, and this might be a really good way to say that this is the right thing right now, but we could use you later on. So I think that's really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think this is a great place for us to kind of pause as we kind of reach towards the end of our program and sort of address some final questions and thoughts and comments. And it's been so exciting seeing the chat box. And I noticed that Sarah from Doha, which is, hey Sarah, all the way across the other side of the world, she says, have any of you had difficulty with volunteers who think the job you've given them is boring? And my museum doesn't have a huge number of volunteer jobs, but they're really important. We just can't do them ourselves. And yeah, we've had volunteers who definitely feel underwhelmed or feel like, and the other challenge, Sarah, that I've had is that we have volunteers who sort of think that once they've sort of tasted one activity, they want to just kind of take over, and so they've sort of tried to sort of have more sort of responsibility than they actually sort of need to have, or that our staff are willing to give them. And those are really challenges. And my policy is always just to try and have a really open and honest conversation, and just say, here's kind of where we're at, here's what we're doing, here's why we need you. If you find this boring, is there another way that we can can you do something else in addition to the things that we need you to do? And I've tried to sort of really just have those open and honest conversations. And I saw some questions about interns versus volunteers earlier, and I've had the same conversations with our student interns who feel that, doing some certain tasks are sort of beneath them, or they just don't find them interesting. And so being aware that that's the reality, and that also maybe trying to give volunteers a variety of tasks can be really a sort of beneficial way to kind of keep people interested and stimulated.
Yeah, and I think, just going off of that, Richard, some of the framework that we talked about before, like, having an agreement in place, and the interviewing, I think, really can kind of dispel some of those myths and know that it's kind of that right fit. And then also, if you have a variety of different volunteer opportunities, that's a way to, if that one fit isn't good, maybe they can do something else.
Building a position, too, where there is different levels where you move up with time. Once you master the simple stuff, you can move up. Sometimes it's not possible, but that's obviously a good way to design a job, and that will keep people interested. Because I think for my museum, I know this is the major one motivation is I want to learn stuff. So when they stop learning anything, you're likely to lose them if there isn't something engaging, interesting, fun, I don't know what, that happens. So that's a challenge for staff is to build that into a position where there's, even if it's outside of their job, there's something cool that they can see when they come in that day. It's a good way to kind of think about it.
I completely agree with you. We have a mentor program for our museum guides, and also for our gallery guides. And that's a great way to get volunteers more engaged and to be more involved, on a different level. So that's been something that has worked very, very well for us. And I know people were talking about awards as well. And here at MIM, we do a variety of different type of awards. Sometimes it's there's like announcements in the monthly newsletter, like about who's had the most hours, and those types of things. But then there's a big appreciation event that we do. And so it does acknowledge certain things like time, like if there's people that have come who've given a certain amount of time. But there's also things where people they're nominated by their fellow volunteers or by paid team members. And in that, there could be like, who has been a mentor, who's the best new volunteer who's really taken initiative that year and showed things. And we also give an award for the paid staff as well, and those are voted on by the volunteers. So I think that's a really, I know people were talking about buy-in, but that's a great way to buy-in, to get buy-in, is to see recognition from volunteers for the paid staff as well.
Absolutely, and I see Rachel asking a question about has anyone had issues with volunteers who are looking to get their foot in the door when it comes to jobs. And that's definitely something I've encountered before. But, I make it a point in interviews to just sort of say, just to let you know, this isn't, volunteering here can certainly be a great way of building your experience in museums. But, right now we don't have any jobs open, and I just sort of very openly say, this is not sort of a hold-in pen for people who are just waiting to get a job. So, I just try and be very open and honest about that. But it sounds like you actually have someone who's there and is, not being very productive to your programming. And if they aren't sort of meeting the roles which are laid out in that job description, then I think you can go back to that sort of conversation about what are your policies and procedures for, for want of a better phrase, disciplining them, or, sort of bringing it up with them. And that might be a conversation that, again, you have with your HR team or your director as well. And as well, I see, lots of people talking about recognition of volunteers. But Valerie asked a question, donor or member who wants to volunteer, but it is not a good fit. And that is a great question.
That's a big one.
and I'm not sure I have a great answer for you there, Valerie. That is some tricky politics. What do you guys think?
I think you have to be really sensitive. I think you need to see if there's again, if you have different roles, can they, can one of those roles be a good fit for them? And if it can't, I think before turning away, you really have to have buy-in from, from your director, or any of your senior leadership that needs that support. So I'd have a conversation with them about that and how, what are the things that you can do for them. So that would be my suggestion.
I know that if a board member cousin or nephew or whatever wants to volunteer. Staff do try to accommodate that if they possibly can, but if it's not a good match, it's not a good match, and you shouldn't take that person on. You do need to try to get the support from the top, and from whoever that board member is who refers their nephew or whatever to understand that it's a competitive thing. You have 100 other people also applying for that position, and you're going to take the best match. And so you need to get that buy-in and not have a climate where people expect that this was just going to automatically happen. It's easier said than done.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Lois. And I know we're sort of, coming to the end of our time, but we wanted to close by just sort of reminding you that once you've placed your volunteers and that you're ready to get them trained and set to work, really having these what am I trying to say? These sort
methodologies?
These steps in place to ensure that you have a really sort of robust setup. That's going to really, really help you when it comes to actually sort of running your volunteer program on a day-to-day basis. And, these conversations in the chat box have been so great, and I feel like I'm taking a lot away. And we'd love to engage with you all either by email or I know the AAM annual meeting is coming up, and I know we'll look forward to seeing you there. But also the AAMV listserv is also a great place where a lot of these conversations are happening on a sort of day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and we just so appreciate, having those contacts. And I have to say, if you're not a member of AAM or AAMV, we definitely encourage you to become it, because these are great resources.
Well, this is Greg. I want to take a moment to thank all of you, Carly and Richard and Lois, for being a part of this program today. And as I mentioned at the top of the program, this is an ongoing series in partnership with AAMV. And so we're looking forward to our next collaboration, which will come later this year. I do want to thank all of you in the audience for being here today, and remind you that we have several related recorded webinars available on this topic and other HR topics. So if you're interested, you can always visit the AAM website to learn more. And I know that many of you in the audience are members or come from institutions that are members, and we want to thank you for that. If you are not a member and you're interested in learning more, I really encourage you to visit the AAM website to find out some of the benefits of being a member of the American Alliance of Museums. And thank you, of course, for participating. You'll notice up in the upper left-hand corner, we brought up an evaluation link. We'd really love it for you to click on that yellow button and access an online survey that will give us some feedback on this program to inform future programs. I do want to say a last thank you to my colleague Adam LaFacci at Learning Times for once again being an excellent host. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
And to close out our program at the bottom of the hour by saying thanks for participating. This is Greg Stevens, Assistant Director for Professional Development. Have a terrific afternoon.